just finding it, and then I'll share my screen there. Oh, yep. Okay, I know where we are. Yep.
Don't show the map, show Street View straight up.
Okay. Oh, okay. Yep. Just got to get my Street View running. It's needs its morning coffee, I think. Hold on a second.
This is quite a busy intersection, I'm guessing, Stuart.
It's got some interesting challenges to it.
Okay. And all types of road users present, heavy vehicles, pedestrians, cyclists?
Yeah, to a point.
To a point?
Definitely heavy vehicles.
Definitely heavy vehicles, okay.
Okay, we're good. I'm in there and I'm just driving. Okay, let's share this with everybody so Stuart can take us through. Okay, so Max, you seen that?
That's come through, yep.
Yep, so if you zoom up to the intersection, just making sure they haven't updated Street View. No, excellent, they haven't updated Street View.
Okay.
Excellent. So this is State Highway 662. It's in Marlborough. It is the primary link between Nelson and basically the East Coast. It also is a link down into Picton and has quite a lot of freight run. There's a railhead that is at the other end of this road. I'm going to say in August 2020, it was still posted at 100 kilometres per hour. It has a gnarly little left-hand slip lane, as you can see, for vehicles that are coming along and turning left into State Highway 62 there. Heavy vehicles made up 20% of this intersection, relatively balanced across all movements. What you tend to see is people parked at this intersection wanting to turn especially left. When you had heavy vehicles coming along, their view was blocked from seeing anything coming down that left-hand slip lane. Also knowing that vehicles will jump out from the left-hand slip lane and other interesting things. So if you're sitting there trying to look to your right, you're blocked by the trucks, and they can be multiple trucks, and you cannot see a thing, and cars appear at 100 kilometres coming down through here. There is a offline shared user path, which is a wine trail cycle track onto the side, which is pedestrians, and there is a level of some on-road cyclists, but not a lot. And Mitchell, you can't talk about this one either. You know too much about this intersection.
Okay. So what are they parking there for?
So this people park over there as a sort of a, they head off up to surrounding areas to work. So people will go in here and they'll get picked up by vans and consolidate and things like that. Big, wide, open road, speeds 90 kilometres per hour, plus trucks are pushing, those that are not governed are pushing over 90 kilometres per hour, motorcyclists. So generally a fair number of users. High tension power lines supplying power to a sawmill. So they're 33 kV lines that you see there.
Let's talk through then. So this is very. I can see why you picked this intersection. It's quite interesting. Let's talk through those factors systematically. So let's talk about exposure. So you've already mentioned quite a few things there that influence exposure. So what do you think? What did you put as the particular ones influencing the exposure of?
So I had the fact of the T intersection, the hidden and the posted speeds being significantly high, the number of vehicles, and the fact that we've got those high tension power lines sitting to the left and things like that. So you have run-off road risks, you have bullet versus target risks, you have a whole lot of risks sitting in there. So everyone is exposed to a lot of different things.
Yeah. So those are, I suppose, all those factors sort of, I sort of, in my head was arranging those things you reeled off, which are all very important factors in the total end risk. I was sort of putting some of those into likelihood, some into severity, and some into exposure. So the ones that you mentioned earlier with the volumes, the high volumes really are the big exposure driver here.
It is high volumes being relative for this road. So it's still only, I think it's a 5,000 vehicles per day, but 20% of them are HCVs.
Yeah, so the 20% that are heavy vehicles, so the numbers of those are taken into account in the exposure when we sort of do a safe system assessment. The percentage and the weight of them, where do you think that'll land? Exposure, likelihood, or severity?
They're sort of spread across a lot of bands because the severity is high if you get hit by one of these things.
Yes.
Extremely messy if you do. The likelihood is fairly high as well because they're not bound to one movement. They're across all the movements. So there's heavy vehicles turning out of these roads going both directions. There's heavy vehicles turning right into this road. There's heavy vehicles heading straight through. There's heavy vehicles turning left. So they're fairly balanced across all the movements.
Yeah.
And you're exposed to them because there's actually quite a lot of them that come through here.
Yeah, well, that's right. The quite a lot of them's very much the exposure factor, and I agree with the weight and the mass being the severity when things happen with these vehicles. It's going to be bad, isn't it, at these speeds? The likelihood one's interesting. I think the way you've described it, I would categorize the fact that they're coming from old legs and the like just within the exposure. Oh, I can see how you've landed on likelihood there. I'd probably have that as the exposure, and the likelihood for me is are there specific features of this road environment that are not good for heavy vehicles for one reason or another? Are there sight lines blocked at height, or are there particular factors that are going to influence heavy vehicles? Because heavy vehicle drivers usually, and there's lots of caveats on this, but usually are less likely to be involved in a crash. But when they are, they're really bad. So we get them reported a lot more.
It's not so much the heavy vehicles that are the concerns. It's the other drivers misreading the speeds of the approaching vehicles.
Yep. No, yes. So, okay, so we've got that, and then you mentioned some numbers of pedestrians and cyclists, and so they're sort of exposure of those road users and motorcyclists, really down to the numbers. When we get to the likelihood, you mentioned a couple of really great sort of likelihood factors, and really sort of, so which things that you mentioned do you think are the likelihood ones?
So I had the visibility being blocked by the left-hand slip lane, which are notoriously bad configurations. We're seeing a lot of problems with them.
Yeah.
So especially when you've got heavy vehicles just blocking that road visibility.
Yep.
So I think I had that one. I'm trying to remember back into what I wrote down in my. Also the speeds in terms of the likelihood through there as well, and I think that was it. I can't remember. And a run-off road because of the power poles that are just directly opposite the T intersection. Those large concrete power poles. As if someone is avoiding them, they look a lot closer than what they are.
Right. Okay. So that's a really good summary there of some likelihood factors. And yeah, this one, the dynamic visual obstruction. So it's a bit annoying that I've got this truck just there to, let's see if we go back in time, we can get a better view of that. There we go. Okay, so we've got what we call, dynamic visual obstruction issue here, which is, perfect spot. So any large vehicle, masking that. And it is really a likelihood factor if you have that, if you have sightline impediments and the like. But this is, as Stuart said, this is common around the place, and across Australia and New Zealand, we have a lot of trouble with this configuration. Not just if it's a slip lane, but also if it's a left turn lane in its own right. But it can really, increase the likelihood of crashes there. So that's a really interesting one. So then the presence of power poles and hazards in the roadside are the likelihood factors, and how close they are to the road, how many there are. They're the likelihood factors of runoff road. They're going to increase your likelihood. So if a vehicle leaves the road, there's more poles, there's more chance that they'll hit something, and there's your crash, rather than they'll leave the road and then be able to come back on. The rigidity of those, though, sits in the severity factor, which we haven't quite got to yet. Yeah, other things, there's plenty of things here influencing the likelihood of crashes, either making it less likely or more likely. The speed, as Stuart said, really going to be a highly influential one. Just the sheer fact that it's give way controlled. The control of the intersection is one that's influencing the likelihood. We've got the line marking, might have been read line marked by now.
Poor pavement condition, poor line marking, big wide open road, so there's not a lot of vertical side friction generated. It's big and flat. There's some wine. There's the vineyard to the left. They've got some dirty great big posts, but they're quite a wee way back anyway. So
yeah, those are all great likelihood factors. And in a safe system assessment, we're trying to actually, and we'll see this next module, but we're trying to list not just the ones that are that we're concerned about, but also some of the ones that are keeping it good. Well, not good. This one's obviously got some challenges, but make improving things a bit if there are any. So yeah, that's so there's just a few likelihood factors. Now let's talk about severity factors there, Stuart. What did you think?
Side impact of at 90 degrees for vehicles that are coming out of this intersection, either heading, primarily the ones that are heading in this direction here, they will have a 90-degree hit into any vehicle that's pulling out of there.
Yep.
And they will not, because of the limited visibility, it has happened. And everything else like that. Vehicles heading the other way, not quite at 90 degrees, because they've got the turning and they've got a little bit of an acceleration lane. But even still, that's high speed, so survivability is low.
Yeah, and that's really good analysis of severity there. You've thought about the angle, you've thought about the speed, and you're right. Up at those speeds, even that you can see actually quite nicely the angle of we're talking about probably for collisions here. That is still not within our sort of generally considered survivable level speeds at the 100 or the 90 or the 80 that we're talking about. And then you've also probably got secondary challenges as that happens with some holes and the like. So we mentioned earlier the heavy vehicle percentage being a factor in the severity. So if the incident was to be with a heavy vehicle, it's going to be more severe. So you can sort of factor that in your severity a little bit, as you'd mentioned earlier. The rigidity of those poles and the like are factors there. So you might sort of look at your different lighting poles as well to try and determine if they're, what is that, an impact absorbing pole, or is that a rigid pole?
Yep. No, it's a Oclite one. Doesn't have the tearaway base, but it is frangible.
Oh yeah, so an impact absorbing, I think, as opposed to a slip base, which is a bit odd in a relatively high speed environment. But
it might be there actually.
I think it might have been there, but it's buried into the ground. That one's a slip base. But you got your rigids sitting behind and the like. So speeds and angles there, as you say, they're going to be the big ones, and the speed for any vulnerable road users involved is obviously the big factor in how severe the crash is going to be. Interesting one. Sorry, I'm just going to slightly jump away. This is a little gripe of mine, but I don't know. I'll leave it to you to decide how influential it is. I just don't like seeing, hopefully it's still there, yeah. I don't like seeing speed limit signs on the approach to an intersection where you have to give way or where you don't have priority. It's just a subtle subconscious clue to a driver that their road continues on. Because you see speed limit signs where you have the continuity of your priority. So this is a strange arrangement to have that there. I don't know why that. Why that would
doesn't help. Also, in that several years ago they removed a whole lot of pine trees that were behind this intersection. So when you're driving along there, because of the way the road is profiled and everything else like that, it does appear that the road carries straight on.
Yeah, so you've got a see-through effect, and then you've got these subtle clues to drivers, exactly as you're saying, and you get a row of trees, you get nothing in the background, you've got a power pole on the other side of the opposing road, which is going to continue the tunnel sort of vision. You're just going to, it'll be 1 in a million drivers that are, maybe it's a little foggy or they're a little intoxicated, they see the 100, they're driving along with 100, and I think their road continues on, and then all of a sudden, intersection upon them, they'll slam on the brakes when they realise, but they might be out in the intersection. So that's just another likelihood factor, I'd say. That sort of stuff that to me is sort of, when we're drilling into the likelihood of crashes in a safe system assessment, it's very similar to what a road safety auditor would do, looking for those sorts of things. And we want to do that and then combine it with that energy considerations. Okay, so that's excellent. I mean, this is I couldn't have hoped for any more as our example here. So this is good. But now you're going to have to tell me what can we possibly do to influence the exposure to crashes here?
So what we'd be looking at doing is reducing the number of conflict points, reducing speeds at these conflict points, and removing hazards where we can, such that if run-off road events occur, the likelihood of hitting something is greatly reduced.
Okay. So that's, So you've given me a raft of ideas, which are all very good at reducing trauma. I'm just going to try and categorize some of those. So reducing the conflict points, very, very good thing to do from a road safety perspective. Interestingly, as we categorize in the safe system assessment, reducing the conflict points we attribute to a likelihood reduction. Now, traditionally in road safety analysis, we've really called that exposure. So there's always a bit of confusion there. But the reason it's attributed to likelihood in a safe system assessment is because the number of vehicles going through is our exposure factor. The number of conflict points they have to navigate or potentially navigate is a likelihood of crash factor. So, so that's one. And so how are you going to get rid of some conflict points, or how are you thinking that that might be possible?
Off the back of a fag packet type design, potentially install a roundabout at this location, based on the sort of configurations and things like that. That's sort of a there was an option of closing the road, but given that it is a state highway and everything else like that, and the primary link between essentially Nelson and Picton for the freight, and guess what was constructed this time last year?
Ah, there it is. Okay, so well played to tell me to go to the street view and not the aerial as I would have. But
yeah,
without knowing this at all, I would immediately looked at it and I said, roundabout. We've got to have a roundabout there for sure. And I'm loving the fact that it's half built, it looks like.
Yeah, that was, yeah. So that was during the process of it being constructed.
Fantastic. Okay. And so the roundabout, we would say we'd reduce the severity of crashes, and it will do a wonderful job. In the safe system assessment, I kind of on a case by case decide whether I'm going to reduce the likelihood of crashes or not. Now, Stuart's made that wonderful point about conflict points, and there's less conflict points, which would say generally less likelihood of crashes. We do know that often, or some roundabouts have issues with rear ends, side swipes. They're very minor incidents, but we do sometimes see a lot of them. So I'd have a little bit of a look further at the design of this and get really into it before I decided whether to allocate some of that. But it's looking quite nice there, quite a good size roundabout. Yeah, everything's looking good. That's made me happy. If started the day well for me there with seeing that. I was going to suggest the potential even for a compact roundabout at this location, if with some of those challenges of the high voltage power lines and costs associated with any moving of those and things like that, you might have been able to squeeze it down, but it looks like it's.
What we ended up doing is moving. The power poles got relocated, so they've actually been pushed away from. There's no power poles in and around the intersection. We actually relocated them and put 2 additional poles to move them out of the way. The compact roundabout was sort of discussed and looked at, but given the complete balance. The complete balance of the number of trucks and things like that, and the likelihood of them going through there, and also to ensure that we had good visibility. And it's a pity we can't actually load up the street view. I'm trying to track down some pictures, which I'll email through to you so you can have a look. Yeah. What we did is we built up the centre island of the roundabout such that that puts in some vertical elements for approaching drivers so that they're well aware that there is a roundabout coming. There's some signs that sort of lead people in, all changing the visibility to know that something is happening. We had a couple of challenges, and the concern was if we went for a compact roundabout, we have that apron. That apron, we would lose that ability to have that background imagery or key elements to explain to drivers that something's happening ahead of them. Yes. So it's that balance of risk of, yes, a compact may have saved something, but we may not have had the same outcomes as what we were hoping for. We were lucky in that we had the land. The land, effectively what you see is what we could use. Yeah.
That's excellent analysis. Yeah, because you've got to think about the compact from all of those perspectives. Tell me, Stuart, is this now the path for the pedestrians and cyclists, or is that?
Yeah, so there wasn't always, the path was always there, but what they do is actually come down through into the 2 wineries here. So the path is more directed down into the wineries. You can't quite see it underneath it. We did provide in the central island, we have, or in the island, in the Splitter Island, we have provided the possibility for people to go through there. But the two wineries were quite keen on getting, encouraging them to come down into their stores, basically.
Yes.
Rather than crossing at the state highway. Yes, we've still got the posted speed change in around here. We have, through some of the challenges of building the pavement up, we actually generated a raised safety platform by default. There's some underground services that we had to avoid, so we had to lift the pavement. So we ended up with a slight ramp in there by default. We didn't actually end up putting one on the main approaches, but I can tell you through discussions with the agency and with various people who are operating on this, it is working really well. There's been no issues and everything else like that. And things seem to be just working.
Brilliant. This is really wonderful. If we step back and imagine that we're back looking at other ideas on what could have possibly been done. Sorry for the traffic on. Not that. In terms of exposure to crashes, when you got that question in the safe system assessment, or you get that, influencing the exposure of crashes would really have to be things that would change the volume of vehicles or pedestrians or cyclists, which, as you mentioned, is involving really closing roads, completely separated bike facilities. So hypothetically, if you had a bike facility that could be completely separated and run along there away from the road in the intersection, that would eliminate the exposure for cyclists if they or using it, or reduce the numbers of cyclists that are on the road. So that's very much in that space. And the likelihood, the roundabout is obviously the preference here, and it's great. But things around the signs lines, opening up sight lines of the old intersection and things like that are reducing the likelihood of crashes. But you really want to address that severity as you've done, and do things to get those speeds down and the angles better. And what a beautiful way to do it! What a great start! Thank you, Stuart.
I can tell you, when we were out on site observing this, so I stood on site for, we spent about 2 to 3 hours just observing traffic. We probably saw close to 3 potential serious crashes within an hour of cars, because it was a tourist, it still is a tourist route, there's just weren't the tourists, it wasn't necessarily tourists, it's actually locals. But we saw numerous number of times of cars pulling out when trucks were heading north-south, and the guys on the trucks they had their jake brakes on and they had everything on trying to pull up to stop. Yeah.
Incredible. It's and I suppose the wider challenge we've got is that there are probably many hundreds of these types of intersections around New Zealand that we need to be addressing, and we need to do it fairly quickly. So great example there, but we've got lots more to do, don't we? All right, thank you, Stuart. Thank you very much. What a wonderful start there. I'm going to stop sharing my screen there.
Thank you, Stuart. I'll just remove your permission to talk now, so you can be back to you, Ken. But I was just going to suggest, Ken, if you do want a site inspection done at that site, I'm more than happy to visit the vineyards around there, and those mountains in the background looked quite tempting.
I was just talking to a couple of my friends in New Zealand, Colin Brodie and Fergus Haight, about scheduling some time to get out and see a few different sites. Nice. So I'm a step ahead of you there, Max.
You always are.
Fergus was on the site visit. There you go. He's a good man. That's excellent. All right, Max. Well, I might get into some slides unless you've got something else to cover off.
There's a question regarding the cost of the roundabout that perhaps Stuart might be able to answer. Cost was 5 million. There you go.
5 million.
Thank
Yep.
you, Stuart. Other than that, no, over to you. Thanks, Ken.
Yeah, 5 millions. Yep, I would say that's about what I'd expect for that size of a roundabout. I reckon you could, yeah, the compacts. I think we could get in for around, well, maybe save about 40% on that potentially, is what I'm seeing for. So it's not like we get it in a compact roundabout in for next to nothing, but there would a bit of savings to be had. But yeah, thank you to everybody else as well for getting your assignments in. As I mentioned, they'll get marked. You'll get some feedback, and the really important part of the assignment is that clarity around exposure, likelihood, and severity. Because when you go into your safe system assessment, we need you to be very clear to apportion those into the right areas, so you're not double counting risk or double benefiting any sort of treatment. So Max, if you can just fill them in on a few things for a second. I've just got to find the slide.
Yeah, no problem.
The assignments and things, anything that needs to be done.
So at the end of today's module, I will just share my screen so you can have a look at Moodle. I can sort out some tech issues, and I'll just hop into student mode so you can have a look at what Moodle looks like at your end rather than what it looks like as an admin. So here it is, Moodle. If we have a look at the end of module 3, what we see here is there's actually a quiz for the end of today, and we've also included some videos as well. And these videos are about Dutch design at intersections, particularly focused on vulnerable road users, for cyclists and pedestrians, and how they go about protecting those vulnerable road users, as it's a different kind of ball game that they play over there compared to what we tend to adopt here in Australasia. And yes, some good information in those 2 videos. So if you do have time at the end of the module, we recommend watching that. It's not part of the competency requirements, but if you are interested in the design in that space, we do recommend those videos.
Thanks, Max.
All good. All good at your end, Ken?
Yep.
Over to you.
Okay. So as Max mentioned there, we're going to have a bit of a chat about vulnerable road users. The final sort of piece before we just give you the mechanics of filling out the safe system assessment. So after this, you'll have all of the ability to allocate exposure, likelihood, severity. You'll have good ideas around what are some of the factors influencing how you're going to score things. We'll talk to you about that. So what's increasing severity, what's increasing likelihood, exposure, and vulnerable road users have their own sort of categorization within a safe system assessment. So we have that for pedestrians, cyclists, and motorcyclists. The assignments and the ones that I flicked through, I generally thought that we were pretty good from what I was seeing on likelihood and severity. I think exposure was still confusing a few people, so make sure you get that feedback. Really, the easiest way to think about exposure is just think of numbers. If you can put a specific number to it in terms of the volume of vehicles, the volume of pedestrians, the volume of cyclists, volume of motorcyclists, then that's sort of your exposure. Everything else sits in one of those other categories. And you know, the treatments that influence these are really closing things off, because you limit the number. It's the number of people that can get through there, or that complete separation, meaning that, again, there's no numbers on their exposed to those crashes. But I think we're starting to get head around it. And one thing you haven't got yet in detail are the sort of definitions out of the Australian Safe System Assessment Framework. And they will really help you, because they say, you know, exposure refers to in what number road users are there. But this AADT a number of motorcyclists, cyclists, pedestrians. So that's the numbers. And it can be a little bit confusing on some of these scoring things, because Austroads put out the Safe System Assessment Framework and some scoring advice, but it was fairly light, and it was fairly, it was thought through, but there hadn't been a lot of safe system assessments done. So through the process of lots of safe system assessments being done in New Zealand, in Australia, and a few around the world now, people are discovering scoring challenges or questioning things, as we like people to do. And so some of the jurisdictions have developed their own guidelines which address some of the issues, but we've identified a series of things that don't have good clarity in any of the published documentation. And so we've put out sort of these industry notes as a bit of a holding piece on some of those questions that are not really well answered, associated with safe system assessment scoring. So things like, how do you score a route which has multiple intersections and maybe has changes in the characteristics of the road environment? So it's not a homogeneous, it changes, maybe it goes through a township or something. Like, how would you score that? So we give some advice on that. We've got some information here on cycling facilities. So a bike lane, or a separated bike lane, or a Copenhagen bike lane, or an off-road park. I mean, where are we allocating these in terms of exposure or likelihood or severity? So we've got some advice on that. A bit of advice on the likelihood scoring. That'll become more relevant after next session, where we sort of talk about how you get a score of a 0 or 1 or 2 or 3 or a 4 for likelihood and exposure and the like, and a few others just in how you get to an intersection score and things like that. So we've provided you all of those on your memory stick and in Moodle for your reference as you're going along, and sometimes in, well, certainly if you have questions and there's a fact sheet on it, we'll point you to the fact sheet, and that'll should help you understand some of those things. So by the end of this module, we want you to be able to connect the One Network framework, movement and place thinking with the safe system. And we want to identify characteristics of vulnerable road users, pedestrian cyclists and motorcyclists that align highly with safe system principles, and categorize key risk factors for vulnerable road users into those exposure, likelihood, and severity, which you're getting sick of me saying, but it's very important. So let's talk about the One Network framework and movement in place. Now, some of you will be experts in this strategic sort of planning area, and as a safe system assessor, it's just important to have a level of understanding of this philosophy and this strategic planning thinking. The reason for that is not because it's going to change your assessment and your scoring. So you're going to look at the existing bit of road, and you're going to look at exposure factors, likelihood factors, severity factors. You're going to bring all of that together and put an assessment of the existing conditions. You're going to get, if they give you a design, you're going to look at that design. You're going to analyze, okay, what's going to change? How's that going to influence exposure, likelihood, severity? What are the changes going to be? And that's your assessment. And it doesn't matter what the One Network framework is, the movement in place, that is the assessment. What will happen? But you also, in a safe system assessment, make some recommendations or things for the project team to consider. And this is where it's really important to have an understanding of the context from a strategic planning perspective of the project and the network and what's happening there. And the reason for that is you can achieve high alignment with safe system principles in a number of ways. And the way you do it will often be dependent on your One Network framework and your movement in place categorization. But let's delve into that in a bit more detail. So really the idea of sort of movement in place or link and place, some jurisdictions would call it, but is acknowledgement that our streets and roads have more than just a function of moving people and goods. They have a place value that yes, they might have been built to move people and goods, but community has, has developed around them. We see lots of cafes and pubs and shops and all sorts of different activities around different roads and streets. And the place value we put on something, the place value is really associated with that social interaction, trade, community feel and enhancement. And so what we do under this is to start to categorize roads in their place value and their movement function, or their movement function and their place function. And where do they sit, or where do we want them to sit? And you can see there's lots of great New Zealand documentation around One Network framework and movement and place, and we can do many days on it on its own. But really, I think these diagrams sort of sum up some initial thinking quite well. And you can see there is a rural one and an urban one, and well played to New Zealand for splitting two out, because most jurisdictions just have the one and it can get fairly nasty and overlapping and weird. But we see there, I'll concentrate on the urban one, that we have these areas of high movement and low to no place value, and they're really the transit corridors. And that's your motorways and the like, or your full dedicated cycleways. So I should say that movement is not just cars and trucks. I mean, it could be public transport, could be cyclists, could be pedestrians. It's movement of people and goods in any form in which decisions are made, that's how we want to encourage the movement to happen. So you've got transit corridors as your example there of they're completely movement corridors. You actively do not want people congregating, socializing on or around these streets or cycleways or motorways or the like. Down the other end of the spectrum, you've got the civic spaces, and these are ones that have this very, very high place value and very low to no movement function. And these are malls or malls or areas like that, where it's all about socializing, trading, interacting. That's where you go to sit and have a coffee and catch up with friends, and the market and the stalls are there and all of that sort of jazz. And so you can see there that we have then these categories around it of things like urban connectors with fairly high movement function and a bit more a bit more place function, but still not as much. Local streets sitting down there as low place value, low movement, and city hubs very challenging because high place value and high movement function, and a bit in the main streets or high streets there. This is a really tough category in terms of how do you get high safe system alignment while giving us good place value and good movement function. But we'll talk a little bit about some techniques to do that. So really, at the start of a safe system assessment, as you're gathering context and understanding of the projects coming up, you ask for movement and place categorization. You talk to them about this. You say, where would it sit on this? If they haven't done it already, hopefully they would have done it. But they might even say things like, well, it's a city. It's probably a city hub at the moment, but we actually we're turning it into more an urban connector because we've got a parallel route, which is going to be more of an activity street or something like that, And so you go, okay, urban connector, thank you. That's given me good intel when I come to trying to make any helpful recommendations in improvement in alignment with safe system principles, because I know that, we're not necessarily trying to have the highest place value, and movement is still a very much priority. And then you probably ask, okay, movement in what sort of forms? Are we talking bikes? Are we talking cars or public transport, or what is it? And then you can do, similar for the rural, where you've got the anything with a bit more place value, or your stopping places, and then you've got your urban roads, and the connectors and the like. And bigger ones I could have used there, but I think you've got the picture. Some, as I say, some of you will be saying, "Yep, know all this, no worries." But let's take a few of these areas as examples, and we'll do a little exercise. Yeah, we'll do it very shortly and give you a chance to have a stretch and fill up your coffee or water. And so the sort of civic spaces, it's been an interesting one, as we've seen with COVID and different pop-up infrastructure or tactical urbanism becoming more and more. We're seeing some areas that have been probably up in these categories being pulled, into, just basically having less movement requirement, or, finding themselves moving to more place value. And that's been an interesting example. There are some tactical urbanism pop-up areas which had quite high traffic, and now has just become a bit more of a place to hang out, and street dining and those sorts of things. But let's have a look at this one. We're going to say this area, we are aspiring to give it into the civic space category, okay? Civic space, and then it's been said, the strategic plan has said that's what we want. And what I'm going to ask you to do, and giving you 5 minutes now, is to suggest changes to this street environment, this very artistic impression of a street environment. It's currently 40 km/h speed limit, but it's been identified as a civic place. So your job is to suggest alterations that give us better alignment with safe system principles, and also give us more of the place value of this area. And what I want you to do, just because I always like this, is to categorize any suggestions you have into exposure or likelihood or severity. So I don't know, if you say more lighting or something like that, but say more lighting bracket likelihood, because that's going to reduce the likelihood of crashes if it's lighter at night. Now, obviously, I don't think that's going to change the place value of it, and will give you a small reduction in the likelihood of crashes. But I just use it as an example because it's very much on the peripheries of what we're doing. So I'll give you 5 minutes there. Max, we can afford 5 minutes, can't we? Yeah.
No problem, Ken. Yep, 5 minutes.
And just jot your ideas in, and we'll be back in 5. I'll give it another minute there, Max, and for people just to pop it into the chat.
No problem. Lots of good ideas coming through.
Yeah, very impressive, isn't it? Okay. Wow. Some really excellent ideas in here. I'm loving the categorization as well. People are really starting to get quite fine-tuned on that, which is wonderful. So I'm going to read through a few of them. I've been sort of reading them as they come, looking for common themes and ideas, but really well done. So a few people have sort of immediately popped in there, close off the road to vehicles. And I think that's always a wonderful starting point for a civic space, to ask that question of, is there even any need for vehicles to be going through this area? And you would eliminate the exposure to pedestrian or cyclist crashes with the closing off of the area to those vehicles. And you're very within your rights to be asking that question for these sorts of spaces. Now, if those are not available, then so you do have to have some vehicle movement through there. So we've gone up a little bit in that movement categorization within the movement and place framework. Then we start to look at some of those other ones that we're seeing that quite a few people have put in. So the exposure would be altered by blocking that off. Then others are going in there, and there's lots of support for getting speeds down in one way or another. And I'm likely to say everything from speed limit reductions, influencing the likelihood and severity, the creation of shared zones that give pedestrians the priority over vehicles, different surface treatments, different raising of the areas and the like, and really all influencing the likelihood and severity of crashes. So that's they're all wonderful things. Then there's some people talking about pedestrian crossings in particular, and pedestrian crossings really sort of push up the movement for vehicle function of a sort of civic space. Now, you might be saying that sounds a bit weird, but the reason by it is, as soon as that dedicated crossing point is placed, it's saying this is a road for vehicles, and pedestrians, you are allowed to cross here, right? And obviously they cross in other places, but that is then the sort of the way that road is visualized as a movement corridor, and the pedestrians are inhibiting that movement. So if that is the case and movement of vehicles has become more of a priority, then they're very good, raised crossing points and the like. But if it's really still trying to sit very heavily in that civic safe space area, you'd want to be more lowering speeds across the area and trying to give good permeability and free movement for pedestrians in a very safe manner. And your shared zone style treatments are very much that way. A little bit similar with the cycleway, and if you start to dedicate cycleways and cycle facilities, it's a movement corridor through there for the cyclists. And again, you'd have it more of a meandering, mixing one in a civic space rather than the cyclist lane. But it all just depends on, you know, what are you trying to get out of this road. And you can see there's a little window into the way that I'm saying that you can get good safe system alignment by really slowing it down, removing vehicles, having that, you know, interweaving of everybody at a very, very low speed. Or you can get it by starting to separate out, you know, cyclists moving through there a bit faster, a pedestrian crossing and the like. You're still getting great alignment with safe system principles, but it's starting to change the characteristics of that road environment or street environment. We've got ideas there around removing the parking, and removing the parking is an interesting one because it opens up sight lines, so you get a reduction in the likelihood of pedestrian crashes and the like, but you do widen the roadway, which gives potential speed increases of vehicles through there. So in complementing that, as many of you have done, is to widen the footpath, to have raised sections to slow speeds down. So you don't want to just remove parking and hope for road safety benefit, because it's probably not going to give you much road safety benefit. So the reduction in likelihood you get is probably going to be overtaken by the increase in speed, which results in severity and returns the likelihood of crashes that you may have saved there. Lots of support for banning vehicles, or even looking at larger vehicles and the challenges they may face with blind spots and not being able to see some of the vulnerable road users, increasing potentially their likelihood of crashing with a vulnerable road user in these environments. Those are wonderful ideas. Max, anything else there that you think I might have not mentioned?
Just a simple one, but the idea of streetscaping treatments, just adding landscaping and planted areas to really improve that place value. May not necessarily have a road safety impact, but certainly achieves that strategic objective of trying to make it a comfortable spot for pedestrians to congregate and gather and enjoy their time there. So I agree with that.
Yeah, that's certainly a big part of placemaking, and you can do some wonderful stuff there. And it can really complement road safety interventions in slowing speeds down, and it provides that wonderful area. You always do need to be careful that you're not introducing road safety issues with that as well, be that blocking sight lines with planting or the like, but we can get win-wins all around.
And just had a question that I thought I might pass over to you, Ken, just regarding an opinion on these shared spaces and relatively high speeds of things like e-scooters or e-bikes, and those kind of using that area that's kind of meant for pedestrians and slow movements. Just that conflict there. Any tips, any suggestions?
Yeah, well, it is a great question. It's an emergent. I think we'll see this emergence of all these other vehicle types rapidly entering the market, and we need to be a bit more nimble in our policy making and the like. But anyway, that side of it. In terms of an infrastructure perspective, well, I would say that if you have e-scooters zipping through there, it's actually increasing its movement function, isn't it? So we need to start redesigning and catering for that movement function through those areas. So that's a challenge there. And then there's the policy elements around speed limiting some of those devices and how they work. But yeah, I don't have great answers on it. I know there's a lot going on in that space. But I just, it is another form of transport for movement in our movement and place categorization. We've always known that. I mean, movement of pedestrians, we would, if an area was a walking thoroughfare, we would call it a movement corridor and think about it accordingly. Well, an e-scooter movement corridor is what it is. Okay, some wonderful ideas there. Thank you very much. And a few artistic impressions, which are very much agreeing with what people are saying here. Again, artistic impressions, so don't take too much out of it, but you can see there immediately you go, well, that's a nicer place, isn't it? That is where you'd want to play and have a coffee and catch up with people. And we can immediately see it's going to be safer, lower speeds. And yeah, I don't think that there's necessarily the need for a crossing point as it is there. I mean, the whole area could really be a shared zone, and you'd have that free permeability across any of these areas. But yeah, I think that's very nice. And the speed, you can see extremely low, but it's a civic place. It's not, we're not trying to put movement through there. If the movement does go up, this is where you can start to I suppose, segregate or provide specific areas for different road users. And that could be, as you can see there, public transport, or it could be the cycleways or the like. By doing that, you're actually starting to erode a little bit the place value. You're still retaining pretty great place value in this sort of artistic impression with the areas to play and have coffee and trade and the like, but you are providing more movement function out of the area. We go to local streets. This is where we see lower place and lower movement requirements, and that you don't obviously tell the residents of the local streets that we attribute low place value to their road. It's more at that societal level, and the trading and the socialisation and the like. But in these areas, really the protection of the vulnerable road users becomes the dominant factor. And the fact that there's not a high movement requirement means that vehicle speeds can be significantly brought down. And really we want to see that through the use of things like local area traffic management. You can reduce the exposure significantly as well by blocking off some of these streets, not providing that network to run through, blocking a lot off, and that's going to reduce the exposure to crashes, the likelihood and severity through just significant speed reduction for vehicles, through local area traffic management, speed limit reductions, and that's then providing us with a lower exposure and low likelihood and low severity of crashes. It also will enhance the place value a bit out of the areas. So these sorts of areas, it's got a lot of traffic and action going on from the local street, but similar idea to the other one, but just a bit more movement ability there. So slightly higher speeds, and it's still a pretty great area. But let's go to, I suppose, some of the more challenging ones here. And we're going to go to the city hubs. And these are, in these urban area city hubs, quite a challenge, because you can see there it's high movement and high place. Now, these could change along a route, of course, but the city hub one. So let's have another little exercise here. If this road was, this section of this highway or whatever it is been determined as the city hub, this high place, high movement. That's what we're aspiring to get out of it. And so we're looking for alterations to move it into that space. What sort of things could we be changing here? So currently 70 kilometers per hour, you can see a lot of vehicle traffic, a lot of public transport, freight, bikes and pedestrians, but it's got pedestrian overpass, pedestrian fencing. It's got shops on either side and a few other restaurants and things. So I'll give you this one. I'm not going to give you 5 minutes. I'm just going to give you 2 minutes to pop in a couple of ideas and allocate them on exposure, likelihood, and severity, and then we'll have a very quick chat about that. Okay, Max?
Not a problem, Ken. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we'll give it another 30 seconds there. We're just jotting a few ideas down. So I think somebody dropped out and coming back and the confused as to what's going on. Another little exercise, just thinking about ways to make this getting the category name. City streets, was it, Max?
City hubs. You
hubs.
were quicker than my typing there, Ken, but I was just responding to them.
No, good. And seeing lots of good ideas. I mean, I really think this group has got a great handle on this concept of a one network framework moving in place. Good little bit of discussion about one-way streets going on in there. And I think that's interesting. One-way streets can be quite interesting in terms of that alteration to the likelihood of crashes to a degree where you get an easier, simpler movement and crossing for pedestrians and vehicles entering off side roads and the like, but you do often get increased speed, and somebody pointed in there a bit of increased complacency to a degree around the driving, and then it can be very challenging to intersect a one-way road with other roads, especially for cyclists are trying to cross those facilities. So yeah, it's an interesting thing to do a safe system assessment on. Max, in the cycling infrastructure course we do, uses a one-way road as one of the examples for facility. You use York Street, don't you, in Tasmania as an example?
That's correct. Yep. So they're certainly out there. They exist. And yeah, just to add to that, also within the one-way environments, if you were just to, pop up some signs and say, that's it, this two-way thoroughfares now one way and that's it, you will certainly have issues with higher operating speeds and that kind of complacency within the road environment. So it's about ensuring there's other infrastructure out there that would not promote high operating speeds, not promote hooning or anything like that. So it's about thinking of more than just putting in some signs and hoping that will do the job.
Okay. As I say, wonderful input on this one. So we're seeing a lot of people looking at separated cycle facilities, potentially utilising the service road for these cycling facilities. Sorry, I'm just reading quite a few of them. I've seen somebody would like to add a flying fox, which is a novel idea, but they didn't tell me whether that would influence exposure likelihood or severity. I think it would influence exposure because some pedestrians would be zipping over in a flying fox. Speed, people are looking to reduce the speed to get the likelihood of and severity of crashes down. The segregated cycle lane, have a read of that fact sheet as to whether it would be exposure, likelihood or severity. There's a lot of sort of determining factors. I mean, it's probably going to be likelihood depending on if there are access points or intersections it has to cross. For the mid-block bit, you might be able to say it's exposure because there's no exposure, but most of the time we end up allocating it into likelihood of crashes. There's a bit of discussion around this pedestrian overpass and whether or not that's something that would be kept or not kept. And it's a fair question to be asking, because if we are trying to aspire for a high place value, it's a real challenge when you're blocking pedestrians off, making them walk up here and across, and it's just starts to erode that place value. If you completely block off all pedestrian movement across the road and the like, big barriers, force everybody to go up here, yes, you get high alignment with safe system principles for pedestrian crashes, but yeah, as I say, the place value has been eroded from that. If you could completely tunnel the road under and then have this wonderful civic space on top, then you've got some wonderful stuff going on. But yeah, so I would in these sort of spaces with those one network framework aspirations actually be getting rid of that overpass. But the only way you can possibly do that to keep safe system alignment is to have some significant reductions in speed and some really good crossing facilities for pedestrians. A few other great ideas in there, but I'm going to keep just ticking along. I mean, there's an again, artistic impression, and obviously don't take too much out of it, but you can see immediately that we're providing a wonderful, a much nicer place for people to have their drink and the like. We're still putting pretty great movement function here for bikes, for public transport, for cars, and also for freight in there. Now, if your mind was immediately moving to movement of cars and trucks only, then we've reduced the capacity through there. But these stretches, I think, can perform pretty well. The speeds are a little bit lower than we might expect for a major movement corridor, but I think it's very it's appropriate and achievable for areas we put high place value on as well. The protection of our vulnerable road users is paramount in these areas, and you still can get pretty good movement function through them and into areas that don't have as much place value, and the speeds can go up again, and we can address crash risk through some other measures. So Ryan said 10 lanes to 5. Is that right? Depends, I suppose, if we count extra footpath as a lane. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Sorry, I'm counting lanes now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think it's almost the same, assuming you count those as a lane each, which I think we absolutely would. If you're talking just traffic lanes, then yeah, that's a different story. But that gets us into a whole other discussion, doesn't it, around mode choice and transport planning and lots of exciting stuff. But I'm going to just move that aside and go back to safe system discussion. Max, anything else to add?
I was just going to suggest, with the 40 km/h speed limits within those high movement and high place functions, you could look at perhaps variable speed limits. So when you actually have all your pedestrians out and about, perhaps it's during the day, that's when they congregate, that's when the trading occurs, that's when you have the lower speed limit in place. During the evening, when this is not such a place function, that's when you can increase the speed to let the movement of vehicles within that space travel through there at high speeds. Just a suggestion, Ken.
Yeah, no, good. Reducing the likelihood of crashes there, and a bit the severity as well. So yeah, no, that's excellent thinking. Thank you, Max. And we see this emerge, not necessarily as pretty as the artistic impression. It's still pretty nice though. So this one's recognise this, no doubt, Christchurch, and you can see the sort of same ideas coming forward with providing those movement functions through there with bikes, and still vehicles are getting their movement through there, and we're starting to develop more and more place value around it. And you see areas like that, and then protected intersections, which are part of that idea of continuing the movement for vulnerable road users, being cyclists through there, still getting the ability to manage traffic with the signalisation and some pretty good movement. Place function as well. Final category, and we won't do it as an exercise. I'll just briefly mention it. But when you're into those urban connector style areas, this is where we can actively start to restrict a whole lot of movement or congregation of pedestrians. I shouldn't say movement because it could be, but this is where you do the pedestrian fencing and have one, crossing point, or have overpasses. If you have, you really would actively try to make this more an urban motorway. If it was passenger vehicles that were your major, where you're trying to move through there on freight, you'd do cycle ways with, that are uninhibited, so they would also potentially be grade separated off other facilities. But it's not going to be the best place to have a coffee or hang out. In fact, you're actively going to discourage that through the infrastructure and the way it looks. But even on those routes, if there's those points that these roads are crossing, the conflict points, we want to get speeds down to within tolerable levels for particular crash types. Things like the raised intersections are really coming into play in these urban connector style routes. Max, I might let you sum up and talk to us a little bit about some cyclists and maybe pedestrian facilities.
No problem.
And we've got what? Oh, just under half an hour to go.
Okie dokie. Let me share my screen.
There's a Wally that is on that one, just the one Wally there, even though it went away and came back.
It's important to confirm. So cyclists and pedestrians generally considered our most vulnerable road users on the network, particularly within our city hubs and metropolitan areas where there are, high volumes of our cyclists and pedestrians. The severe injury at a 10% risk that we're generally looking at is actually a 20 km/h impact. So it's very, very low. We certainly operate our road network at much higher speeds than that, where we have high congregations of pedestrians and cyclists. So we're certainly not achieving that 20 km/h impact speed. However, we tend to look at the probability of fatality of these pedestrians and cyclist crashes, which is instead the number 30 km/h. And the reason for that, if you remember back to our first module and looking at the probability of fatal crashes for pedestrians or for cyclists, the curve that looks kind of like this. The 30 km mark is when things spike really, really quickly, and when things get kind of out of control really, really quickly. And that's taken at 10%, and that's that 30 km there. Sorry, my handwriting is not as neat as Ken's. But that's the reason that we tend to adopt the 30 km/h speeds for those impact speeds that are generally considered survivable for vulnerable road users, so for pedestrians and for cyclists. And I will just make a point that is taken as the impact speed or the collision speed. So that's not the speed that's on the speed sign, or that's not the operating speed or the 85th percentile. That's the collision speed. So in other words, you could potentially have higher operating speeds within the environment, but where pedestrians and cyclists cross, or where the conflict point exists, if you can bring speeds down to that 30 km/h speed or less, that's where you'll see significant safety benefits for these vulnerable road users. Our young and our olds are even more vulnerable, which makes sense as their bodies have not yet developed, or they're more frail in nature and more inclined to severe crash outcomes. Young in particular, they're more difficult to see, so they can be hidden by roadside hazards or road infrastructure like hydrants or shrubs or anything like that. And they're also, young are more prone to kind of erratic behavior. They could run out onto the road and things like that, which makes them in this exceptionally vulnerable group. So if you were doing a safe system assessment that was perhaps adjacent a preschool or adjacent a retirement village, you could consider this as things that are increasing either likelihood or severity for crashes occurring, particularly severity in that instance. So let's have a look at what type of treatments can we look at to actually improve alignment with safe system principles. And here we have an example of what's called a Copenhagen lane. And this is where we've actually flipped our parking lane. We've brought that out and away from the curb, and we've brought the bicycle lane onto the curbside. So traditionally, things would be flipped in a conventional design. You'd have your parking adjacent to the curb, and then you'd have your cyclists riding right against the parking lane or within the dooring zone. So this type of design does a much better job of protecting cyclists in that they're away from the dooring zone, and there's this huge buffer in between the general traffic lane and cyclists. So if vehicle were to run off road, they're more likely to strike a parked vehicle rather than having to strike a cyclist. So there's this massive separation between the road users, which is another key benefit of this design. When we look at these protected or separated treatments, we generally would take them as reducing the likelihood of an event occurring, not the exposure. And the reason for that is because it's very rare to see protected bicycle lanes just, you know, from A to B without any conflict points at all with the road environment. They cross over driveways, they cross over local streets, they cross over laneways or arterial roads. And so the conflict points do still exist. So that's just my dog, in case you can hear that. He's got a cone on his head, so he's pretty upset at the moment. Hopefully he's not too distracting. Ken, if you want to jump in at any time, let me know, but I'll keep going. So that's the protected bicycle lane. And hopefully that makes sense as to why we would consider that relevant to the likelihood of crashes occurring rather than just the exposure, because at other lengths of this particular treatment, there still is exposure to vehicles. When we come to intersections, this is one means that we can look to actually improve safe system alignments with regards to vulnerable road users. And this is what's called a protected roundabout. And the reason it's protected is you can see at each of these legs, there's actually raised crossing points for cyclists and for pedestrians. And they also are given the priority. So roundabouts traditionally do not fare very well for pedestrians and for cyclists crossing. And that has a lot to do with just general traffic are focused on entering the roundabout. They're looking for vehicles within the roundabout, and they're not necessarily paying attention to if there's a pedestrian or a cyclist crossing within that space. So their mind is solely focused on entering the intersection, looking out for vehicles, not necessarily looking out for pedestrians and cyclists. This design kind of flips that philosophy, whereby the priority is assigned to vulnerable road users on the minor legs, and importantly, it's all raised up as well. So should a collision occur, the speeds at which that impact occurs is lower. Okay, so in other words, if a cyclist was struck crossing over this leg here, the speeds that occurs is much lower due to the raised nature of this particular protected roundabout. So these are fantastic things to see. We're starting to see more of them being rolled out across Australia and New Zealand, and there's certainly plenty of examples of these overseas. Some instances you don't see that raised feature, which doesn't really add to the, or it doesn't really maximize the best practice of this intervention. So if you are able to raise the legs, that's really would be considered the gold standard in this space. If we were to look back at our network classification and determining whether certain legs have high movement functions or a lesser movement function, this slide kind of really captures this design philosophy and how it can actually be applied to particular detailed designs. So I'll just take you through what we're looking at here. This is obviously a multi-lane roundabout, and it's set in a rural setting. If you could imagine, this section here would be kind of like a state highway, a very, very high movement function road. And these minor legs would be more of a local or a collector. And it likely also be a high speed environment, but the actual strategic function of these roads are not quite as high. And yes, and we can see that actually does affect the treatment that has been applied on the legs themselves. So if we have a look what's happening, we've got off-road shared bicycle lanes that are brought out and away from the general traffic, which is a big win. You don't want to be sharing general traffic lanes with cyclists in these high-speed environments. So it's good that they're off-road. And when they cross over the minor legs, this is an example of the priority is given to cyclists and to pedestrians crossing. It's also raised, as what we saw in that previous slide. When cyclists and pedestrians cross over the major state highway, they're not given the priority. Instead, cyclists and pedestrians have to pause and give way to general traffic because their movement function is considered more appropriate to maintain in these instances. And yes, the cyclists and pedestrians have to stop and give way. So that's just an example of how you can kind of translate those strategic objectives for particular roads and how that can impact on detailed design and how that would work in these environments. Another slide here that looks at appropriate treatments that you could look to implement at certain speed zones. So within the 0 to 30 km/h speed limits, speed zones, lane sharing is generally seen as an appropriate treatment for cyclists. And for those that aren't familiar with this symbol here, those are called sharrows, and it stands for shared arrows. And it's basically meant to convey to motorists as well as to cyclists that cyclists can now claim the general traffic lane. And rather than being pushed to the curb, cyclists can travel right in the middle of the traffic lane, and they're basically treated, as another vehicle within that space. So if the operating speeds are between that 0 and 30 km, these sharrows are seen as an appropriate intervention. As we get into higher speeds, that's when we look at things like relocating parking or creating those Copenhagen bicycle lanes, or one-way separated bicycle lanes, as they're also called. Within the 30 to 70 as well, we want to relocate cyclists altogether. So if we can push them off-road, that's obviously a big win if you've got that carriageway space available. And there's also a mention here of anti-dooring lanes, which is not a very common treatment. I'm not going to go into detail in it today, but if you are interested in what that means, you haven't heard that term, feel free to send me an email and I'll send you some literature to confirm what that is. But this slide is all about just showing what type of treatments you could look at depending on particular speeds. And importantly, if you're looking above the 70 km/h speed zone, our priority should be for off-road bicycle paths. And we're certainly not meeting those targets, as cyclists can ride on shoulders on our 100 km/h state or national arterials, state highways. So yes, if we can get off-road facilities in those spaces, that will greatly improve the level of safety for cyclists. Any questions I need to answer in that cycling space before I hop into PEDS, Ken?
No, I think it's actually there was a bit of discussion about the regulations around the priority crossings for cyclists through the intersection there, but I think it's sort of been covered. The way I really think about those is that you're essentially creating a road. Well, you're treating the cycleway as a road. And so it becomes an intersection with the cycleway having priority. So you place your giveaways and through there, sort of, I pondered it quite a bit, and it's used quite extensively around Australia, and New Zealand sounds like it's got a couple from some other comments that came in, which was good. Thank you.
That's okay. And the dog, he's not too distracting. He's okay.
We're okay. There's some other dogs in participants' houses. Feeling sorry for your dog.
He got bitten at the dog park yesterday, so he's got a cone on, he's got a bandage on, he's not sure what's going on. So thanks for your patience, everyone. We'll hop into pedestrians, and we'll look at some, I suppose, priority treatments that we can look to improve pedestrian safety. This is an example of what's known as a zebra crossing. I'm sure we're all very familiar with these ones. The good thing about this type of treatment, it is fairly universal. Where you see those stripes, that's a pedestrian space, that's somewhere where you need to give way to pedestrians. So it's got that kind of, visual cue for motorists, slow down, give way at these locations. So I think they work very, very well here. However, one thing that you can take away from zebra crossings is it relies on that visual cue. In other words, it relies on alert and compliant motorists. It relies on a motorist citing that there's a pedestrian crossing there and they need to slow down. And as we know, we don't work within a perfect world. We do work with humans who are fallible. We make mistakes. We may miss the signage. We may miss the pavement markings. We may completely misinterpret what those stripes on the road mean. And therefore, having pavement and signs alone is not quite enough to really align highly with safe system principles. So we do encourage, wherever you are promoting pedestrian crossing points, if there is a possibility to raise these crossing points. So you can see here, this is raised up at the footpath level. And that's just got wonderful benefits for both likelihood and severity. And I'll chat through why it applies to both of those categories. For the likelihood, what you've actually done is you've brought pedestrians up a level. In other words, you raise the conspicuity, you raise the awareness that pedestrians are crossing within that space. They're up at a higher level and they're crossing, not down below, but kind of at a higher level to motorist line of vision. So it's easier to see pedestrians crossing within that space. The other significant benefit is in terms of the severity of a crash, because you've got this hump in the road, you are forcing vehicles to slow down. And even if they've missed all the cues of the sign, it could be line marking on approach, it could be flashing lights. If they've missed all those visual cues, you are still forcing vehicles to slow down as they approach this conflict point where pedestrians are. So you're treating the actual conflict point. And that kind of goes back into that conversation I was having before, where you don't need to see the entire mid-block having the 30 km/h low operating speeds. If you can manage to get your conflict points reduced to those speeds, then you've done a really, really good job at aligning with safe system principles. Fully acknowledge that pedestrians and cyclists may cross wherever they want, but if you're trying to make these facilities as attractive as possible, you're meeting the desired paths, people where they want to go and where they want to be connected to, then I think you've done a really fabulous job in improving the road safety environment of that particular area. For those that aren't familiar, this is actually known as a wombat crossing. So that's the reason we keep referring to Wally the Wombat. So that's the sign. Oh, no, it's not. Sorry, I was talking about something else. But no, they're called wombat crossings. So that's where you raise up the zebra crossing. And for whatever reason, they've decided to use another animal and they've grabbed wombat out of the dictionary. So maybe because it feels like it's a bit of a hump that you have to drive over, like our poor friends, the wombats. Here's another example of the wombat crossing in action. And yeah, just a different type of different jurisdiction using just the pavement color there, natural asphalt as a backing rather than the red. But you do have these pedestrian signs that formalize that in terms of a regulatory responsibility that vehicles need to slow and give way to pedestrians that are crossing within that space. We've got this example. This is in Adelaide, and Ken, feel free to mention if I get any of these details wrong, as I'm not quite across it as you are, but this is an example of a construction site. Actually, I might pop this in the chat. Does anyone know what the speed zone is for a work site in South Australia? And that might be a little bit challenging, I appreciate, for those that haven't travelled to the state, but it's a little bit of a strange one. It's the only one I know that actually use this as a number to bring down speeds at work sites. Ken, have we got any answers?
We got a 50, a 30, and then Sam got it with 25.
25?
Just at the same time as Eduardo and James. They all came in almost instantaneously. So maybe we can give them all a prize. 25 kilometres an hour.
That is a little bit of an odd number, but that's the one that South Australia have adopted. So if you're ever in a work site and driving in SA, that's the speed that you will be signposted, and you will require to drive at that speed. And so this particular road had these construction works going on. They were doing some works just on the signal pedestal, so that workers were behind the barrier there, doing some cabling, I assume, or some ducting. And the main takeaway from this particular example is during the construction sites, while workers are there, we acknowledge that there's a risk for a vehicle that perhaps runs off the roads and collides with where they're working within the work sites. And so the speed gets reduced to 25 kilometers per hour, which is a pretty significant speed reduction. And it's also within that 30 kilometer speed impact that I was discussing before. So it meets that criteria. This lasts, say, a week that they've completed all their cabling and ducting works and everything's back and operational. They get rid of the barriers, they get rid of all their signage, temporary traffic management's over, and the speed is opened up back to 60 kilometre per hour. And you could argue that, well, when the workers are working there, you know, they're focused on their particular task, you know, they're not paying attention to their surroundings, and you know, they're distracted. So that's why they need to have a lower speed limit around them, so they have a safe work environment. And that's all very valid points. We could also argue when a pedestrian is waiting right there, when there is no traffic management in place, they are also equally distracted. They could be on their phone, they could be thinking about a conversation that they had, they could be thinking about work, they could be thinking about their dog, running around the backyards, you know, all these things. It's not as if when pedestrians are waiting there, they're always hyper aware of their surroundings and would be able to jump out of the way and avoid a run-off road collision. So it's just an interesting example of, you know, work safety. We've got that embedded in our culture. We bring down speeds to make sure all our workers are safe. At other times of the day, general pedestrian population, it's more of a, yeah, we just acknowledge there's a risk there, but the movement of traffic is more important. Something to ponder. We do have these examples that are starting to becoming more and more popular, these raised intersections. So this is down in Tassie, and this is an example where the entire intersection has been constructed on a table. So similar to those wombat crossings where you had the raised section just where pedestrians are crossing, this entire intersection has been lifted up, and it really does a fantastic job of reducing likelihood and severity. And that's all got to do with the speeds, because the speeds now through this intersection have dropped. So the operating speeds, or the ability to just drive through there at high speeds, is now no longer available, because you've got a physical ramp that will slow you down to whichever speed that those grades have been set at. I believe for this one, it could have been 30 kilometers per hour, but I might be wrong at that instance. But what that does is it provides safety benefit for all these pedestrians crossing, safety benefit for vehicles that are, you know, entering the intersection as well, because if there were to be an intersection crash, they're now at lower speeds. Safety benefits for cyclists traveling through that area, safety benefits for motorcyclists, safety benefits for all road users installing these raised safety platforms or raised intersections and managing operating speeds at the conflict points. So you're getting wins all around. It's one reason why speed is often referred to as the silver bullet within road safety, because it's just got this miraculous ability to solve likelihood and severity kind of risks. These can also be installed at thresholds. This is quite a good example whereby the desire line matches in quite well with where, you know, pedestrians want to be. They want to be near the shops, and it also gives an opportunity for a parked vehicle to kind of pause and wait there ahead of after the raised threshold, so they don't have to actually block the threshold, which is kind of a common occurrence if the crossing path was right at the threshold there. So this is a good example of where you've managed to, once again, reduce the operating speeds where the conflict exists, and you've assigned the priority to pedestrians, to vulnerable road users. And when you're looking at pedestrianised zones, or you've got lots of pedestrians crossing, it's really fabulous to see that the priority has been given to pedestrians. Ken?
I'm just getting ready to jump into motorcycles.
Yes, I forgot about motorcycles. I better get a move on. So let's have a look at casualty crashes over time. This is just an indicative one, and just wanted to include this graph here to show you this massive step change from the year 2002, 2003. The reason for that is when the default urban speed limit changed from 60 kilometers per hour down to 50 kilometers per hour. Once again, highlighting the impact that speeds really have on the level of road trauma that we see on our network. So there's a clear, evidence that this is a real thing, both from a physics point of view, less speed, less kinetic energy, more ability to withstand those forces, and also just from the crash data that we see, where there are interventions in place, we see the reductions in trauma. Ken, over to you.
Thanks, Max. Slides I want to cover on. Me there for a second, Max.
Sorry, it's missing, or?
Angry at me.
Oh.
Okay.
Try again, I guess.
Sorry about this.
I could have done motorcycles, but I know Ken he's actually got a motorcyclist license, so he's got a bit more experience than me on the two wheels, or the motor two wheels.
I'll just be very quick. Sort of 5 things for motorcycle consideration: sight, surface, signs, strike, and speed. And when we think about those, the likelihood ones are really, can you see the motorcyclist? Can the motorcyclist see what's coming up? Are the surfaces appropriate? Are there signs, warning, informing, guiding? They're all going to influence the likelihood of motorcycle crashes. The strike is, what is the motorcyclist hitting, or what is hitting the motorcyclists, and what speeds are they happening? And the speed, as Max has talked about, both likelihood and severity for motorcycles as well. And I've put in there the reference to some recent injury curves for motorcyclists there, with strikes by passenger vehicles, barriers, trees, and the like. So you can have a look at a bit of that research to help you guide your severity scoring for motorcyclists. But the coloured gradient thing from Module 1 has some motorcycle crashes in there as well. Just the size of a motorcyclist means you're going to score it a little bit higher for likelihood of crashes at intersections, for the fact that it's hidden behind, motorcyclists are hidden behind smaller things like trees, signal controller boxes, shrubs, and the like, and other vehicles as well. So that dynamic visual obstruction is more enhanced when motorcyclists are the ones you're thinking about. The surface really is the fact that a motorcyclist leans while going around a curve or a corner, and has 2 small contact patches on the road. So where any surface deficiencies are more pronounced for motorcyclists. And we call them the canary in the coal mine when it comes to surface deficiencies. They're first to be killed or seriously injured. And so as you're assessing an existing road or a design, thinking about the surface for motorcyclists, when you're forced within a safe system assessment to particularly focus on the crashes, the exposure likelihood and severity of motorcycle crashes. So steel plates obviously going to be more slippery and could cause an issue for a rider, increasing the likelihood of the crash. And motorcyclists are really well tuned into signage, and so consistent, clear signage that warns, informs, and guides is a really effective likelihood reducing factor for motorcyclists. There are these motorcycle specific warning signs that you can put a supplementary plate under to give a specific warning of what's coming up for a motorcyclist in particular, and those are being used a bit more in New Zealand now. And the strike hazard. So the motorcyclist now hitting something. Here's just the European barrier crash test. 60 km/h, motorcyclist sliding, hitting a post. You can see the sort of severity of incident when a motorcyclist hits a fixed point source hazard at 60 km/h. But then if we can put something there to redirect energy and absorb energy, we can get some good reductions in severity. Still nowhere near what you get from a passenger vehicle, even with helmet, body armor, leathers, and the like. The motorcycle is still highly vulnerable to injury, but we can do features of the infrastructure that help out a bit. And of course, speed. Speed is great for motorcycle safety in terms of likelihood and severity as well, and other vehicles interacting around motorcyclists, be that advisory speed, regulatory speed, or other measures to reduce travel speed of riders. We do, I suppose, know that when you're doing a safe system assessment, if you're reducing travel speeds for motorcyclists from 110 to 100, the severity is still at maximum in terms of, we're talking levels of death at those speeds, not getting us down. We do have some reductions in the severity of incidents at some of the lower speeds. When you're getting into around the 70, 60, 50, 40, we're into better territory for reduction in severity of crashes for motorcyclists. But a lot of our high-speed roads, we just max out the severity for crashes for motorcyclists. So there we've touched now on all the road users. And next module, we're going to delve into how would you fill out a safe system assessment? Where do you put the scores? How do you present it? And then we're going to send you out to do a safe system assessment. But there's just a quiz to do now. But that's pretty much it, isn't it, Max?
That's it. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Thanks, Ken.
Thank you. See you next time.